Hello all. Now that we've done all the Java basics, now we'll be visiting Android. So let's get rolling. So in this first basic Android tutorial, we'll be discussing the following things. First, I'll give you a brief introduction to Android. Then I'll be telling you what is Android SDK, and we'll be setting Android SDK on Eclipse. And then I'll guide you through various files, Android files, manifest file, R files, and I'll also tell you what is AVD, Android emulator, and various Android attributes in files. And then we'll also be visiting UI components in Android. We'll be working on them, we'll be understanding buttons, what are intents. I'll also be telling you what are logcats, what are text boxes, shared preferences, creating AVDs, pop-ups, and various messages. And then next we'll be working on Android tabs, then Android menus, and in the end I'll also tell you how to improve look and feel of the application. I'll tell you how to apply styles and themes to our app. And then at the end we'll also be developing some apps using all the things which we'll be covering in these tutorials. So let's start with introduction on Android. So what is an Android? An Android is basically an operating system designed primarily for touchscreen mobile devices, smartphones, and tablets. And Android is based on Unix-like operating system kernel. And you may be knowing this, that Android is one of the most widely used operating system for mobile devices, smartphones, and tablets, as Android covers almost 70% of the market share when it comes to the operating systems for mobile devices, smartphones, and tablets. And all of you know Android is associated with Google, but most of you won't be knowing that Android was first developed by a team which was led by Andy Rubin, and it was developed in 2003. And Google acquired Android on August 17, 2005. And the first ever mobile phone which was developed using Android was HTC Dream. Since then Google has evolved a lot, and here are mentioned few version code and name of the Androids. Like 2.2 was Froyo, 2.3.3 to 2.3.7 was Gingerbread, 3.2 was Honeycomb, 4.0.3 to 4.0.4 was Ice Cream Sandwich, and the series from 4.1.x to 4.2.x to 4.3 was Jelly Bean, and the latest version is 4.4, which is Android KitKat. Now, before developing Android application, we need to go through Android SDK Manager, and what are Android AVDs. So what is SDK? The Android SDK or Standard Development Kit is basically a set of development tools used to develop applications for Android platform. Suppose you are writing an Android code. There should be something we should understand that Android code. So for that we need to plug Android SDK with Eclipse so that it could understand the Android code which we'll be writing to code our Android applications. Now, what is SDK Manager? What it says is SDK Manager separates tools, platforms, and other components into packages you can download using the SDK Manager. Suppose these are the releases which Android was having, starting from 2.2, then 2.3, then up to 4.4. SDK Manager will be having all the SDKs for 2.2, SDK for 2.3, SDK for 3.2, and up to 4.4. And each SDK has certain enhanced functionalities which previous versions were not having. So SDK Manager allows us to choose whatever SDK we want to choose. We can also choose multiple SDKs. We can install all the SDKs at one time. And in this series we'll be using latest SDK for KitKat. So this is Android SDK Manager. And then what are AVDs? AVDs are basically Android virtual devices. And the AVD Manager is a GUI interface which enables us to create and manage AVDs. So what are AVDs? First, let's visit what is emulator. Suppose when you run an application on your phone that requires .apk file. Consider the example of Windows. Whenever you install a software, that software has a .exe extension, and whenever you double click that file, that software gets installed onto your machine. So similarly, if you want to install something on your Android phone, some application is there, that application has extension of .apk, and .apk stands for application package. When you will be developing your app on Windows on machine using Eclipse, so you can see the output of that code using a emulator. You can set up 2 or 3 or any kinds of emulator you want. You can set emulator for Nexus 4, you can set emulator for tablets. I'll show you how to create emulators when we'll be coding the Android. And AVD Manager is a GUI in which you can create and manage AVDs which are required by Android emulator. So AVD Manager is basically a type of user interface by which you can create emulators. By emulators I mean it will provide a GUI where you can see your output. Whatever application you have coded, you can see the output on Android emulator. And AVDs can be created by an AVD Manager. Okay, so these were Android SDK, SDK Manager and AVDs. So let's set up SDK for our Android application.